Welcome, champions. My last video on idle champions of the Forgotten Realms seemed to garner enough of a response and interest to make some more videos about it. I mean, after all, it did net me one entire follower on Twitter, which just so happens to be the CEO of Codename Entertainment, so you know, I'm rolling in the big boy bucks now. Anyway, I figured the best thing to follow up my initial overview for idle champions would be to dive deeper into the champions themselves, and what formation each champion might make a good pick for, if any. I plan to do this seat by seat, covering each champion hanging out in those bleachers. Every champion in this game is tied to one of the 12 seats, and there are roughly 8 champions per seat. Sounds like a lot, right? Probably too much for one video. Normal tier deck would just do it anyway, but this time I'm going to break it up into 12 videos, one for each seat. So, enough about all of that, and as the modern day William Shakespeare says, let's go! Seat 1 is important, because if you know how to count, you know 1 comes before 2 through 12. Meaning it will be the first seat you get to work with. The most logical place to start is with the core champion of the seat. A core champion being the one every single person in the game has access to from the beginning. The de facto sitter of the seat. In the case of seat 1, that honor belongs to Bruenor Battlehammer, a neutral good dwarf fighter. His primary buff to the group as a support is Rally, which increases the damage for everyone in the same column as him. His specialization is a choice between 2 different styles of an increase to his rally. First is a simple flat 100% increase, and his other one is a stacking increase, reaching upwards of 250% total. But it requires him to be within 2 slots of a champion sustaining damage. Obviously, ideally a tank. So while it is a higher increase, you may not always be able to make use of it, so choose wisely. He has an affiliation to the Companions of the Hall. Now, sometimes the affiliation of a champion doesn't really matter, but in some cases, including Bruenor, it does. All of the Companions of the Hall add to a pool of bonus gold find, and with Bruenor, each other member in the formation will also increase his rally by 100%. The Companions of the Hall include Regis in seat 2, Catti-brie in seat 7, Drizzt in seat 9, Wulfgar in seat 10. And while not technically a Companion of the Hall, Pwent in seat 5 will also add to the gold find pool of the companions as long as he is adjacent to another member. Rally is also increased for every dwarf in the formation other than Bruenor. This might sound interesting at first glance, but it's hard to make full use of. Of the dwarfs in the game, you have Binwin in seat 3, who is one of the lower tier damage dealers in the game, so will unlikely see use. Pwent in seat 5 again, who is useful for gold find, but as a buffer, he's in a competitive slot, and his buff racks up as you get kills, so if you're at your wall and not getting kills, he's one of the worst supports in the game. Then you have Beetle and Grim in seat 8, which is 2 champions that swap in and out with each other via their ultimate attack, one of them being a solid support and a dwarf. Solid pick to pair with Bruenor. Seat 10 gets a bit messy, it's where Wulfgar is, a Companion of the Hall, but seeing as Wulfgar is only useful for either a gold find buff or specifically increasing the damage of your formation if you're using Drizzt or Catti-brie as your primary damage dealer. But they are heavily low tier damage dealers, so that's probably not going to be the case. Then you have 2 dwarfs competing in seat 10 as well, one being Orkira, who is a very good support to increase the damage of magic using DPS. But she works best in a formation full of magic users, which Bruenor is not. So if you're using her, you will probably be using a magic user in seat 1 instead. So that leaves Barrowin, who is a solid support and healer and works well with Bruenor. Ultimately, Bruenor is an excellent support and a great starting champion for the game. He is certainly not the best in his seat, but he's pretty good. And of very few formations, I can only think of a Kron formation off the top of my head, he might actually be your best choice for the seat. You know what? Why don't we also make this a tier list? You guys like those, and will love to tell me how stupid I am for misplacing where you think they'd go, right? Hell yeah. I'd put Bruenor in high B tier if it wasn't for one thing, which brings him to a low A tier in my mind. If you watched my previous video, and if you haven't, go watch it, you know what a Azaka farming is, which is simply a formation dedicated to farming gold. Bruenor has a gold find buff, as you now know, but he also has a wisdom of 14 or higher, specifically while using one of his feats. Why does that matter? Well, there's a champion in seat 8 named Nrak, and he has literally one use, and that is buffing the formation abilities of champions with a wisdom of 14 or higher, which includes Bruenor's Gold Find buff. So Bruenor is a multi-purpose of a decent buffer, excellent endgame gold find, and being the first champion of the entire game. This makes me give him a gold star and a low A tier rank. Let's hop right into who is, in my opinion, the best champion in seat 1, and the only one deserving of the S tier in that seat, Orkira Ildrex, a chaotic good dragonborn cleric. She is a healer and an excellent support. Whenever she damages an enemy, they are afflicted with 1 stack of elemental fire, debuffing them and causing them to receive more damage from all sources, stacking up to 10 times additively. This debuff increases in effectiveness for every magnitude of healing she's done in the current run, with her formation ability, Lesser Restoration. For those of you with scientific notation turned on, that just means for each exponent or E level increased. So going from E4 healing to E5 healing in that run will increase it multiplicatively by 1 bracket. Now, all of this alone is excellent, but you can increase that exponent exponentially using a specific type of formation once you have a few particular champions unlocked. I'm going to show you an example and give you a detailed explanation. First of all, she has 2 specialization choices. One allows her to apply 2 stacks of her debuff per application. Okay, cool. But secondly, and more importantly, one that grants a portion of her overhealing to be added to that stacking healing multiplicative buff. So we make a formation that gives as high of a healing number as possible and let that overhealing reach crazy heights, making her debuff one of the best support tools in the entire game. We do that through 4 specific champions. Nrak, who I mentioned before, as Orkira has a wisdom of 14 or higher, so she benefits from that increase, increasing how much healing she throws out. Orkira, who I previously mentioned in seat 10, increases the formation abilities of spellcasters based on how many spellcasters are in the formation. Seeing as Orkira is a spellcaster, this will increase her healing. Arkan in seat 12, who is a core champion with his specialization Usurp, which causes him to slurp up a formation ability from a nearby champion at a higher rate if he doesn't already have it. So we place him adjacent to Orkira so he isn't being healed by her, but is also adjacent to someone who is, so he can usurp it, as Orkira's Lesser Restoration only heals those who are not adjacent to her. And then the crutch of the entire formation, Artemis, who has Observance, which works in a way kind of similar to Usurp, except he just copies the formation abilities at a higher rate from every damage-dealing champion in the formation. So he's observing the usurped healing from Arkan, which is being buffed by Nrak and Orkira. And then you fill the rest of the formation with spell-casting damage dealers. Damage dealers so Artemis can observe even more, and spellcasters to further increase Orkira's spellcasting buff. Ideally, you'll only want Orkira adjacent to Arkan and Nrak, so everyone else can receive her healing so Artemis can observe it. Nrak will never be able to receive that healing because he needs to be adjacent to champions to grant his wisdom buff. Being that her form of support is a debuff, she's very adaptable for where she can be placed in the formation. Just remember, she only heals champions, not adjacent, so don't have her sitting next to your tanks if you're relying on them being healed. All of this already puts her at the tippity top of A tier, potentially even into S tier right there, but what pushes her entirely into S tier for me is that her debuff, this massive increase, will also apply to click damage if that's what you're going for. Just a really solid champion. Now from here on out, let's descend alphabetically, leading us to Dahani, a chaotic good Aarakocra monk, who serves as a damage dealer and pseudo support. I wanted so much for Dahani to be good, as her whole mechanic is kind of interesting to me, and that she paints enemies to give them a debuff, further increased by her specialization choices. She has 10 thresholds to reach, with tracking how many enemies have been painted throughout her entire lifetime, persisting through all of your adventure resets. And once she reaches that 10th threshold, she scales that damage slightly from then on for every painted enemy. The problem here is even if you scale her to 10 and beyond, she still just can't quite reach the heights of other damage dealers. and she shares a slot with some powerful supports for said other damage dealers. Originally, I'd put her into low C tier because her kit and specialization choices at least make her interesting, which, by the way, is a choice between splashing them with yellow paint, increasing gold find, green paint, which makes her attack in an area of effect, and blue, which debuffs the enemy, making them take more damage, which is how she serves as a pseudo support. But let's be real, when you share a seat with Orkira, you can't measure up as a debuffer. However, another champion recently released in Seat 7 named Gazric, which actually made Dahani more useful, bumping her to a higher C tier and honestly potentially even a lower B, specifically for a gold find formation. Gazric has a hefty gold find increase, and is further increased for every member affiliated with the Rivals of Waterdeep, to which they both belong. They also both have 20 wisdom, so each of their gold find bonuses also scale with Nrak's buff, making them excellent choices to pair together for an Azaka farm formation. Next up is Deekin, the true neutral kobold bard. He's an adaptable and effective support, and our first introduction to a speed-based champion. In his case, he offers a speed boost by making enemies spawn faster. His main support buff stacks up over time, up to 20, increasing its effectiveness, but every kill reduces that count. However, as long as he remains 6 or under, enemies spawn 100% faster. And while he used to be vital for speedruns, many other champions now have an equivalent speed buff, and spawn rate increase only helps speeding up runs so much anymore, so his speed utility isn't as good as it used to be, but he's still pretty good. He's also our first introduction to a support that offers 2 different unique damage bonuses via his formation abilities. First is his Story of Doom, which is the stacking buff I just explained, but he also has Troubadour Troop, which increases the damage of your formation per bard within it. You will always have at least 1 stack of this, as Deekin is himself a bard and counts toward that bonus. Now, while the fact he has 2 distinct formation abilities that both add damage to your formation sounds great, and can scale quite well, something to note with Deekin is that while leveling him up, he does not get any global damage increases to the formation. Whereas Bruenor by level cap gives 1.03 E6 global damage, and Orkira gives 1.86 E6, Deekin relies solely on his formation abilities. Early on this can make him fall behind a bit, but as both of his formation abilities are increased by the level of his gear, he can be scaled decently. His specialization choices are pretty simple. The first making his Story of Doom affect every single champion in the formation, effectively allowing him to be placed anywhere in your formation, as it usually requires him to be adjacent. The second increases the effectiveness of the damage buff of Story of Doom by 100%, for when you know you can keep him adjacent, and the third upping the speed increase by 100%. Overall, I feel like he slipped into high B tier with the other speed options out there, but I could be convinced to keep him a solid low A as well. Next up is Ezmerelda, and what I believe is an archetype design philosophy that needs to be changed in this game. Those philosophies being on-kill mechanics and specific enemy type mechanics without anything to back them. Let me explain. At first glance, it looks like she's got plenty to her kit to make her useful, and she has a niche. But it's just that, incredibly niche. She gives a buff to killing enemies of a specific type, natively undead, but with specialization choices you can change that to fiends, humanoids, or monstrous enemies. I farted. The problem is that buff is only in effect at all attacking that single enemy type. So if you don't have enemies of that type, she's basically worthless. You might think her buff would be good enough to justify swapping her in for that type, but without investing in some gear, it never would be. So why split up gear investment between a better buffer that would have 100% uptime for someone you might use just every once in a while? She even has a mechanic that tracks how many of that enemy type you kill, increasing how much that buff offers to the group. In my mind, that would be the perfect place to stick a different mechanic altogether, like, for every enemy of that type she kills, she also grants this buff to the group, for this damage at a percentile rate. So the choice would instead become what enemy type is common in your adventure she can farm to increase that group buff, but alas, no. She does also have some okay debuffs she slaps on the target, one being a raw damage increase, another being a nerf on enemy armor, and the last a minor survivability buff that makes non-boss enemies miss their first attack. So she was a so-so debuffer, but that was before the queen of debuffs in her seat showed up, Orkira, completely overshadowing her. I hate to say it, but without a rework, Ezmerelda is in that rare F tier. When your entire kit focuses on blasting a specific enemy type out of the water, and even then you're just average, what reason would I ever have to use you? Even in variants where your champion choices are extremely limited, you should only ever take her if you literally have no other support to seat. And if she is a choice in a time gate, only take her when she is literally the only champion of your choices you haven't unlocked yet. Or if she is competing with a low tier damage dealer like Binwin, Ishii, or Rosie. Now we have Kthris, the chaotic neutral drow warlock, a rock solid support being similar to Deekin in giving 2 different buffs to the group. But unlike Deekin, he also does have global damage upgrades, though smaller than many other champions, capping out at 6,300. Although there is a negative tied to him, and that's simply having him in your formation takes away 10% from your gold find bonus, but in turn increases the damage of everybody and feeds that amount to a demon of his via his formation ability Hordes Person. Once he has collected enough coins, that demon pops out to massively increase the damage of your lowest damage dealing champion in your current formation. His second ability, Unseen Encouragement, buffs the champions furthest away from him in the formation, but this is simplified by the specialization choice you're going to want to get, as his choices are between reducing the amount of coins you need to get for his demon with Hordes Person, or allowing Unseen Encouragement to target all champions simply not adjacent to him. I found him to be a solid B, simple to slot in your formation and an effective damage boost with 2 formation abilities, each with gear slots tied to them. For a bit on the silly side, we have the nerds. Yes, the candy. To be honest though, I kinda liked the idea of their mechanic, which is that there are 6 nerds in total, but only 3 can be active at a time. You use their ultimate ability to shake them up and rearrange them, but their specialization choice allows you to pick one color to be static and remain after each shake. And all 6 of them offer different buffs, debuffs, or benefits to your formation, so it's all about pairing the best 3 to be the most useful for your formation. Orange is a fighter and a tank, increasing the damage of champions behind them while under attack. Yellow is a cleric who heals champions in front of them. Pink is a rogue that leaves behind traps that explode for 10 times their damage after a duration, and makes them attack faster. Red is a ranger that debuffs the enemy, causing them to take more damage. And finally, green is a bard who increases the damage of all adjacent champions. Now, all of this might sound quite interesting, as I honestly think their design is pretty cool, but they have 2 big problems. First, they do not qualify for any patrons. None. So if you're running patron adventures and variants, they can literally never be used. Second, while they have a ton of utility, for all of those roles they take, all of their numbers are pretty low. So no matter what 3 you are pairing, they will never be the best buffer, debuffer, or damage dealer. They're really only ever useful for one specific scenario, and that is if you are using Artemis as your main damage dealer, as he scales off damage dealers that also serve as supports. Honestly, even though I love the idea of their mechanic, they hover in the D tier and almost dip their toes into F. But being that they actually are useful for Artemis, who is a top tier damage dealer, I can't justify putting them in full-blown F. Sisaspia is a neutral evil Yuan Yuan-Ti druid that serves as a healer and support. Her kit revolves around a number of spores she manipulates with Halo of Spores to serve as debuffs to the enemy and buffing the formation. She keeps 20 spores in her reserve, and every second latches one of them onto an enemy. And while each non-boss creature can only have 1 attached, bosses can have 4. For each spore attached, enemies take additional damage over time. But her other formation ability, Symbiotic Infection, flat out increases the damage of champions within 2 slots for every spore in her reserve. Per spores that are in her reserve, she also heals champions within those 2 slots with Symbiotic Healing. Her specialization choices are a bit interesting, either flat increasing her damage increase of Symbiotic Infection, increasing her spore reserve to 30 but only generating 1 per 3 seconds, or increasing both infection and healing by 200%, but only while her spore reserves are completely full. Unfortunately, she's another victim of an interesting kit that just doesn't have the numbers to back it up. And while she can be a decent healer, again, we're competing with Orkira here, who is also a healer and a by far better support. She falls somewhere in the low C to high D rank for me. Turiel is a lawful good Aasimar cleric that takes the support role and also acts as a pseudo tank. He grants a flat damage buff via embodiment of the law to every champion behind him, increasing multiplicatively for each column further back they are. Ideally, you want him up front in the formation with your tanks, because every time an enemy attempts to attack him, he redirects it to a different valid target. So as long as there is a minimum of 2 slots in front, pair him with a tank up there for optimal placement, because for every attack he redirects, he increases the buff amount of Embodiment of Law for 30 seconds, stacking 30 times. He also increases the effect of Embodiment of the Law for each fiend enemy type he attacks, and even more if he redirects an attack from a fiend. Oh look, a buff that involves a specific enemy type that doesn't only require that enemy type. He also grants Voice of Authority to all champions after he attacks, causing their next attack to deal more damage based on their Constitution score, scaling multiplicatively for every point above 10. His specialization choices are simply a buff to Embodiment of Law based on how many lawful champions are in your formation, or a buff to Voice of Authority. Basically, only take the latter if you don't really have lawful champions slotted. He's a rock-solid support and can serve as an off-tank in your times of tanking needs. I think he's a solid A tier, and I got a lot of use out of him in my past playtime before I got more effective tanks in my roster, and Orkira took her home as the queen of Seat 1. And look at that, there you have the champions of Seat 1. Don't forget to place a familiar on the sub, like, and bell. Let me know in the comments if you agree with my tier list, or if you think I'm nothing more than a Neanderthal troglodyte for thinking the way I do. As long as you guys are watching and wanting more of this game, I'll keep trucking along to cover all 12 seats. Look for more in the nearer future than my usual, and I'll see you then. Thanks for hanging around, y'all. I appreciate each and every one of you little bastards. Have a hell of a time out there, champions. Hell yeah.